So good afternoon and welcome to our spring meeting for the Academic Collaborative for Integrative Health Library Special Interest Group. My name is Deb Hill and I coordinate the group here at the Collaborative. We have an excellent presentation in store for you today and I look forward to your questions and discussion. A little housekeeping up front. We are using our webinar platform today as we have a couple of invited guests and we wanted to make sure that we had opportunity to include as many as possible. So you have all entered into the listen only mode. For now, if you have a question, there's a hand raising button on your control panel, and when you go ahead and raise your hand, I can unmute you. So that's one way that we're going to get our discussion going today. You can also type questions into the question box, and I will get to as many of those as possible, and we will take most of the questions at the end of the presentation today. So next slide. We have some guests that have joined us today, so I wanted to just, and some of our newer members of our group here, I wanted to provide a very brief overview of what the Collaborative is. We're formerly known as the Academic Consortium for Complementary and Alternative Healthcare, and basically we work to build partnerships, educate, and collaborate, all with advocating for whole person collaborative and team-based care. So our core membership is from 5 integrative health professions, each of which have a programmatic accreditation body that's recognized by the Department of Education. And this includes the institutions and programs that train the professions of acupuncture and oriental medicine, chiropractic, massage therapy, direct entry midwifery, and naturopathic medicine. So altogether then we are linked to about 375,000 licensed integrative healthcare practitioners and about 180 accredited institutions and programs. So this group, the meeting today, is our Library Special Interest Group, or SPIG for short, and it is one of our formal collaborating groups. And this group is focused on connecting our library staff from our member institutions around the topic of evidence-informed practice. So this group is open to the staff from our member institutions as a membership benefit. But I do want to welcome those of you who are guests joining us today and also some of our newer group members. So again, I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation about the Collaborative. But without further ado, I wanted to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. Next slide. So first, I want to welcome Jane Saxton. She is the Director of Library Services at Bastyr University, where she strives to increase awareness and utilization of the evidence-informed practice approach in the field of complementary and integrative medicine. She collaborates with instructors and colleagues on the EIP instructional modules for the School of Naturopathic Medicine's clinical doctorate program. She teaches various research classes and is increasingly involved in the University Center for Social Justice Initiative. So welcome, Jane.
Glad to be here.
And next slide. Next, I wanted to welcome Ekaterini Papadopoulou, who has worked as an instruction librarian at UW-Tacoma and has taught classes in information literacy at Seattle Central College. Since joining Bastyr in 2016, she has been teaching the embedded information literacy curriculum, and she also teaches a series of research classes for the doctorate and AEAM program at Bastyr, where she works with doctoral students preparing for literature reviews and capstone projects. So welcome.
Thank you. Sorry about the pixelated picture.
I think it works great. It's nice to have a photo, a face with a voice here. Next slide. And I wanted to introduce Angela Morel. Unfortunately, Angela is under the weather, quite ill today, so she's not going to be able to join us directly. But a little bit about her background as she has contributed to the presentation today. She is the senior librarian at the Bastyr University, California campus. And prior to that, she was the instruction and outreach librarian for 10 years at the Scripps Research Institute and Scripps Green Hospital, where she provided research assistance to medical residents and postdoctoral researchers. So in addition to her 15 years of instruction experience, Angela also has participated in the University of Pittsburgh Systematic Review Workshop, the nuts and bolts for librarians. So unfortunately, again, she is out today, but she was a large contributor to the presentation.
And Ekaterini is going to fill in for her.
Awesome.
Yeah, as best I can.
Great. A true team effort today. So without further ado, we'll go to the next slide, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Jane.
Okay, hi everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. So the game plan today is first a brief intro from me, and then Ekaterini will share her experiences from the field along with some of Angie's. And we're very sorry that Angie can't be with us today. As Deb said, we're happy to address any questions at the end of the presentation, and we hope you'll have some. So next slide. I'm going to buzz through some of these slides pretty quickly. First, we wanted to provide a context for what we're up to at Bastyr. Basically, our programs range from clinical doctorates to Master of Science Nutrition, Psychology, Midwifery, to Bachelor of Science completion degrees in the Natural Health Arts and Sciences. Next slide. The library offers a fully integrated information literacy instruction program. And our aim is to ensure that all students in all programs graduate with the skills they need to become lifelong learners. Competencies 5, 6, and 7 are especially pertinent to the research literacy that all health practitioners require today. Next slide. So in this webinar today, we're using the phrase complementary and integrative health, or Complementary and Integrative Medicine, which has the advantage of a pronounceable acronym, CIM, C-I-M, to describe the natural health fields and professions. And we're using evidence-informed practice, EIP, for the clinical approach. Decisions on what to name things are inherently political, as I'm sure we're all aware, especially in what is sometimes still called the CAM professions. But in the spirit of sharing, we've adopted the NIH-ish CIH or CIM iterations. I'm sure you've noticed that NIH has gone to Complementary and Integrative Health, making complementary and alternative medicine a thing of the past. Next slide. Oh, no, don't go. Okay, so yeah, I don't have control of the slides directly. So after evidence-based medicine arrived on the scene in 1996, alternative phrases for this approach to patient care proliferated. And basically, as I see it, the differences between the variations relate to emphasis. Evidence-based medicine and evidence-informed practice, the practitioner-patient experience. And on the level of practice today, these differences are pretty minor, but we definitely here prefer the evidence-informed practice. Next slide. So what precisely is the role of research in the CIM professions today? And many of you have no doubt seen this image, and thanks especially to Northwestern Health Sciences University for the original. It beautifully sums up the music that the EIP approach ideally creates. So I'm assuming that we more or less agree on the following: that every system of medicine requires an evidence base, that most, if not all, accrediting agencies for the CIM professions today require some inclusion of research literacy skills, and that no health practitioner can afford to ignore relevant evidence in patient care. So in order to play clinical jazz, the three components, that is the practitioner experience, the patient preferences and values, and the research evidence, have to be in harmony. For CIM, locating applicable research studies can be challenging, but let's remember that the EIP approach emphasizes the best evidence, and the clinician is the one who determines what the best evidence is for their particular patient. Next slide. Before we move on, I'd like to take a minute to read a quote from David Callahan, MD. Dr. Callahan is co-founder and former president of the Hastings Center, senior fellow at Harvard Medical School, elected member of the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences, and fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences. In 2002, he commented on the pitched resistance to CAM research that so many of his colleagues were expressing, and his words are unfortunately as relevant today as they were then. How is sense to be made of the fact that a large and prestigious group of clinicians and biomedical researchers seems so utterly hostile to CAM, while a large portion of the public, and the educated public at that, seems so attracted to it? Moreover, those opposed to such research seemed, as so often happens with polemics, to harp on only the most egregious examples of bad therapies, bad arguments, and bad actors. That made it easy for them. Next slide. This is my attempt at levity. Hopefully it's good for a chuckle, given that a priori assumptions about anything are counterproductive to the advancement of knowledge. Next slide. So now we move on to something very dear to all librarians' hearts, that is user access. And Ekaterini is going to go into several of these in more detail in a minute. But very briefly, study design. I think we're all aware of the limitations of the randomized controlled trials in relation to whole person care. As we know, RCTs were originally designed and are well suited to drug studies that had a well-defined PICO element, I for intervention and a C for comparison to another intervention or placebo. But SIM practitioners don't often use single interventions in treating patients. And while whole systems and outcomes research are increasingly popular, the RCT remains the favored child. And there's a whole body of research on this very thing, what RCTs are good for and what they're not good for. Funding, continuing funding challenges for SIM research are easily seen at the NIH. So just in 2018, funding for the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, this used to be NCAM, National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine. Funding for that center dropped to $101.8 million. In 2014, for example, it was $124 million, but let's get real, because historically, at least for the past decade, maybe since the beginning of CAM research at the NIH, funding for the center has never exceeded 0.5% of the total NIH budget. So this is an interesting thing, given that the National Health Interview Survey just came out with a new analysis of data, and it indicated that about 59 million Americans spend approximately $30.2 billion out of pocket on complementary health approaches a year. 59 million Americans spend out of pocket $32.2 billion on complementary health approaches in a year. 30.2 billion is $1.5 billion more than the entire NIH budget for 2018. The NIH budget is $28.7 billion. This continues to blow me away because it was the case a decade ago when we looked into this. So, database indexing, we're all familiar with this issue. And among other factors, we're all familiar with two general subject terms that are applied simply because the indexer is not familiar with the subject area, or frequently more nuanced subject terms just don't exist. And Ekaterini is going to talk about this in relation to acupuncture and East Asian medicine for us in just a minute. SIM research also there's this publication bias. In medical journals, publication bias often means that small studies with positive findings are more likely to get published than those with negative findings. The small studies are the ones affected because disappearing a large study with negative results is complicated. Too many people are likely to know about it, but small studies more easily fly under the radar. So the reasons for repressing negative studies range from industry vested interests to journal editors who favor publishing large studies, to authors with publication fatigue having submitted their article several times to different journals and it gets rejected because it's a negative finding. So there are various reasons for this bias, but it definitely exists. And a recent example of the bias portraying a therapy as more effective than the research warrants is Tamiflu. In this case, the manufacturer hid negative studies. So it looked great, and it's not. Now, the interesting thing that I found about this is in 2007, a study revealed the reverse bias for SIM studies based on geographical location. So the authors of this study looked at the 4 top medical journals. 2 are in Britain, Lancet and BMJ, and 2 are in the US, JAMA and New England Journal of Medicine. And they found that positive studies were significantly more likely to appear in the British journals. So US journals, there seems to be far more, well, we know this, there's far more pitched resistance to CAM or SIM research in the US than in the rest of the world. By the way, I would love to see this study updated. If you want to check it out, if you want a colleague to do that with, I think it would be a doable project, and it would be very interesting to see if this tendency is still happening. Okay, and lastly, there's language and location bias. Just brief stats. Medline's indexing about 5,200 journals worldwide. 53 of these are specifically SIM related. That's 0.8% of the total. A very small number, but then again, a lot of SIM research is published in core medical journals. And some of those studies are positive. So I think progress is being made in that regard. So my final comment is that standardized methods are used to conduct research reviews of all types. And this is not only to ensure that the most important studies are retrieved, but also to minimize or ideally to exclude researcher bias. The challenges to SIM-related research that I've just mentioned don't alter the necessity of using standardized methods. But what sets locating SIM studies apart is the need for more inclusive, creative, and nuanced search queries. And let's let Ekaterini take over so she can get into more detail about searching. Thank you.
Can we have the next slide? Thank you. Hi, so I'm Ekaterini, and as was mentioned in the introduction, I teach three quarters of courses in a series for the DAOM program here at Bastyr. Now, the purpose of these classes is to prepare students for capstone work, but also to prepare them as practitioners who continue to engage in the research and who can contribute to the academic conversation. So the classes cover advanced search techniques, organization, and assessment of the research that they find. And they allow students to build tools for engaging in acupuncture academic conversations in order to be able to critically evaluate and do systematized searches and avoid the cherry picking or biasing of their search results that Jane just was referring to there by using loaded terminology. So the fact that the DAOM program has a librarian teaching for 3 quarters on search strategies and resource evaluation, I think is indicative of how seriously SIM programs are taking their contribution to the body of research these days. I think it's also indicative of how complicated SIM research and evaluation can become. So, you know, this isn't a one afternoon workshop. This is 3 quarters that these poor students have to put up with me for. And it's a credit-based class. It's not something that's optional. So I think that's just kind of indicative of how big a part this is playing now in SIM education. If I could have the next slide, please. So what are the challenges in acupuncture research? The general challenges are definitely those that Jane has already outlined. They certainly apply to acupuncture research as well. And sometimes one thing my students and I have noticed is that the the research and then the searchers seem to be speaking another language. Now, sometimes that's literally. If you run just a general search for acupuncture in PubMed, for example, and then put in a language filter, only about 60% of the articles are in English. So straight away, that's a challenge. Around 40% of the research that's out there is not easily accessible to people who only speak English or English-speaking institutions. Sometimes they're speaking a different language in a more figurative sense, in that the indexing terms don't seem to fully map with the terminology of the field. As well as the indexing problems, we also see the emerging problem of fields sort of redefining terms and creating false divides or false equivalents sometimes as well, depending on which side of the debate you fall on. So what I mean by that is, one example would be the distinction between traditional Chinese medicine and classic Chinese medicine. This distinction, while an important conversation for practitioners and in academics in the field, seems to be completely ignored outside of the field. So you end up with the allopathic slant lumping everything together under TCM, particularly when you're looking at subject terms. If I could have the next slide, please. Thanks. The other issue that, of course, we run into is the limitation of the pool of available research. So in order to prepare students for research in acupuncture, along with the competencies that Jane outlined earlier briefly, for the DAOM students, I found that I have to provide much more nuance in my teaching of information literacy competencies. This is in order to give the students the tools to engage critically with the available research. Basically, if you're doing acupuncture research, you can't afford to miss anything because the pool is so small to start with. And then potentially only 60% of that pool is going to be accessible to you due to a language barrier. So that means you really have to be able to do a very thorough and comprehensive search. The other piece of the information literacy that I really have to amp up for DAOM students to address some of the challenges in acupuncture research is that we really have to go into quite some depth about assessing journal quality. For example, we really look at predatory publishing and what to look for as red flags in journals. So something I might teach students to do is look for inconsistent publishing history, no clear peer review process, and then take a look at the editorial boards to see if they have any connection to the subject area they're meant to be editing on, and so on. There are a number of red flags out there. Some of them are used by Beall's list that has obviously been taken down recently, but some of the flags that Beall's list was looking for in creating that that selection of potentially predatory journals, those are the things that I want my DAOM students to be able to engage with. The reason for that is, due to the limitation of research, they often have to rely on pulling in from grey literature and also going outside of the big databases. So if you're going outside of the big databases to find the available research out there, you have to put in an extra layer of critical thinking when you evaluate the quality of the research you found if it's outside of a database. Because as imperfect as they are, databases do have a quality control element that we often rely on. And of course, as I've mentioned with acupuncture, if you're going outside that, that's a challenge. You suddenly have to be able to do that quality control at a much more nuanced level yourself. The other thing we look at is the problem with peer review in acupuncture research, and this of course is applicable to sim research beyond that as well. Are there really enough reviewers who know about acupuncture? And are the reviewers truly experts in acupuncture? Or are they, for example, MDs who took a weekend course? If they're acupuncture experts, then we have the next question to ask ourselves is, do they have enough research experience to create good methodologies from the study? So these are things that I have to go into in much more detail in order to allow students to engage critically with acupuncture research. This isn't something I had to do with students at UW, for example, where they were doing much more mainstream material that had much clearer parameters. Students in acupuncture and anyone researching in acupuncture has to be able to put these parameters in place themselves, and that requires a much faster learning curve and education on the peer review and publication process. So the other thing that I want to make sure they're aware of, Jane mentioned the publication bias issues that we come across, and that cuts both ways. When you're addressing acupuncture research, publication bias is something that could be a Western slant journal being biased against publishing positive outcomes of acupuncture studies. I mean, conversely, though, something we have to be aware of specifically with acupuncture is there a potential for bias? Was it a government-funded study coming out of China, for example? We know that there's been some evidence that Chinese published studies have been biased to publish more positive results. So this is all part of the education that I really have to amp up for the DAOM program to address the challenges of researching in acupuncture. Next slide, please. So onto a more nuts and bolts piece. What does this mean? What do I actually teach? What do I do with the students? First of all, we use MESH headings. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with these. The medical subject headings assigned in by indexers in PubMed. Now, they are a great search tool, as I'm sure many of you know. But I often refer to them as a subject heading search. When I'm describing this to students in other classes, what I tend to say is a subject heading search is a you know what I mean search, because it finds what you're really asking about regardless of how it was expressed. So if I ask for cat, you know what I mean, it found feline as well. That's how I kind of describe MESH to get students into the thinking about subject headings and how they're assigned and indexed. The problem is my description of you know what I mean starts to fall down a little bit when I'm working with DAOM students, because terms relating to acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine, and qi actually have quite a few problems where I start to think maybe they don't know what I mean when I say that. So the headings are a really great way to give insight to how the indexers are thinking about acupuncture and how they are organizing it. So let's take a look at those. Could I have the next slide? So these are the available medical subject heading terms regarding acupuncture. You can see they're pretty broad and pretty limited. There are only 5. In some subject headings, if you put in the search, you'd get up to 20 options to really get at the crux of the issue you were thinking of when you were researching. But with acupuncture, these are the options we're given. And straight off the bat, the first one, acupuncture, the heading, the scope note for it is the occupational discipline of the traditional Chinese methods of acupuncture therapy. So straight away, the term acupuncture, really, most people, when they say I want to research acupuncture, they don't want to research the discipline, they want to research acupuncture therapy. So straight away, there's a bit of a disconnect between the way the medical subject heading might be expressing something and the way researchers and students particularly are thinking about that topic. If I could have the next slide, please. The next issue comes up in terms of the limited hierarchy. So for those of you familiar with MESH, as I'm sure many of you are, it puts things into MESH trees so you can see how the terms relate to each other and umbrella terms above those. Now, what's interesting to me here is if we look at acupuncture therapy, it falls below complementary therapies. It doesn't fall below traditional Chinese medicine. So if we think about that for a minute, there's really quite an artificial divide here in the way that the indexers are thinking about these topics. So acupuncture therapy is just a complementary therapy. It's been completely divorced from traditional Chinese medicine and the system of medicine that developed it. Going off this as well, qi is also in a completely separate area as well. It's not below traditional Chinese medicine, for example, it's under philosophy. So you can see how disjointed the medical subject headings are when it comes to Chinese medicine and acupuncture. If I could get the next slide, please. This gets even more complicated when we start introducing things like dry needling. So for those of you who aren't particularly familiar, dry needling is what some of my students call Western acupuncture or bad acupuncture. I mean, obviously they have their own bias, but I like the way that they were already joining in this conversation of trying to debate what is it. The unclear relationship between acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine is further complicated by the recent move towards allopathic and more Western practitioners using what they are calling dry needling. So dry needling is simply the process of inserting needles into specific trigger points. Does this sound familiar? That's how most people would describe acupuncture as well. So, and there's the problem. The technique, when used by those outside of the acupuncture field, suddenly splinters off and creates a whole new terminology for itself. So to get a sense of how this terminology of dry needling can complicate searching for studies on acupuncture, I ran 2 searches for illustrative purposes. If I could get the next slide, please. Sorry, I should have said, for those of you who hadn't looked at the slide before, if we ran just for dry needling, you got 365. And then if you knocked out acupuncture, so you run a search for dry needling, not acupuncture, you get 191. So for those of you whose maths is as bad as mine, there are 174 articles there that are potentially about acupuncture technique, but that aren't being pulled or recognized as being about acupuncture. So why not acupuncture? To some, this is taken, from Exploring the Evidence, the Challenges of Searching for Research on Acupuncture. I should have just read out that entire article really for this presentation, but I think this really gets to the nub of it. This article talks about how, to some, trigger point dry needling may appear synonymous with traditional Chinese acupuncture. Nonetheless, the two are uniquely different. And this article goes on to tell you why they're different. A more modern and alternate approach to acupuncture recognizes that inserting a needle into the skin stimulates 8 delta nerve fibers, consequently releasing opioid peptides from the interneurons in the dorsal horns. So that's the allopathic take on it. And that's what they're saying dry needling is, and why it's totally different to acupuncture. Now, acupuncturists would read this and say, well, you're just describing what's happening using different terminology. Acupuncturists are so concerned about this, they came out with 2 white papers. If I could get the next slide, please. These are the 2 white papers on Chinese acupuncture practitioners addressing the issue of dry needling. And if I could get the next slide as well. Thanks. So to excerpt from these white papers, we have the acupuncture excerpt saying, dry needling is simply rebranding acupuncture as dry needling, acupuncture points as trigger points. It's simply using English biomedical terms, using the terms fascia, for example, to replace their equivalent Chinese medical terms. So they also have the concern that it's an oversimplified version of acupuncture derived from traditional Chinese acupuncture, except for an emphasis on biomedical language. Broadly speaking, I think acupuncturists would argue that dry needling is just rebranded acupuncture, but divorced from traditional medicine. So some of the nuances and training that go along with that are lost. So when searching for acupuncture in PubMed, we have some of these useful medical subject headings, but they're detachments from Chinese medicine. And then this conflation and erasure of acupuncture that's coming about with the dry needling research that's emerging. These are some of the main challenges when you're searching for acupuncture research. You already have a muddy set of terminology to work with, and then the field itself is getting splintered off as it seems when it gains acceptance, it's suddenly no longer acupuncture. Now it's called dry needling. So these are some of the uncertainties and concerns that start creeping in once you start to critically assess what's happening, not only in research, but in the way that research is getting to us as researchers. It's coming through the filters of publication bias. It's coming through the filters of database bias of what gets included and what doesn't. And then beyond that, we're getting this index bias that's artificially dividing and creating, or artificially conflating, terms that have quite a lot of specific history and practice background in them. The divide in this indexing language, and also the places that will tend to publish research from either side of the divide, means that searchers are really running the risk of existing in a silo of either Eastern or Western practice. And that would mean that you missed half the available research on the practice of acupuncture, regardless of what you're calling it. So if we could get the next slide, please. So I've talked a little bit about how this Western terminology is taking over, and we're seeing dry needling trying to replace, in some ways, acupuncture within the Western canon of medical practice, rather than acknowledging its Eastern roots. This gets compounded when you try and run a more complex search. So we already have the problem of when you're searching for acupuncture, the subject headings in it are artificially divided and now artificially conflated with dry needling as well. Imagine how much more complex this gets once you start adding in medical conditions. So you might run a search for combining acupuncture to see with osteoarthritis, for example. You want to see the effect or efficacy of acupuncture treatments on osteoarthritis. Straight away, this search is combining Eastern and Western terms. Acupuncture is an Eastern term, osteoarthritis, that's Western pathology, Western terminology. So you run into this next problem of, if the research is talking about acupuncture and osteoarthritis, where is the divide in that happening? Is it that the practitioner is using Western terminology and pathology to overlay what they have done in their initial assessment of the patient using traditional Chinese medicine, which might talk about, you know, a qi imbalance or a blocked flow or a yin imbalance? So you're not quite sure what's happening in the background due to this conflation of terms. So let's look at an example. If I could have the next slide, hopefully this makes it a bit clearer. This article is the effect of Hunking 1 on liver yin and kidney yin deficiency patterns in patients with knee osteoarthritis. So this is an article that is looking very much at the traditional Chinese medicine approach, but it's using that Western terminology of osteoarthritis there. Let's look at how that's organized from the mesh terms. We can see that it's got osteoarthritis in there down at the bottom. We also see that it's identifying that this is about yin deficiency. So what's good to see in this is that the indexers who have assigned the mesh headings have not only assigned the Western pathology. In this case, they have assigned the TCM diagnosis as well, but only because it's explicitly mentioned. This, of course, is hardly ever, in fact, I would say never, done in the reverse. If an indexer is indexing an article about osteoarthritis using acupuncture as an intervention, they are not going to map whatever the osteoarthritis terminology was. They're not going to map that back to the TCM terminology unless the original researchers did that in the first place. So you have a body of research that's using traditional Chinese medicine intervention, which implies a traditional Chinese medicine understanding of the body has been taken into account at some point during the process, but that's been lost in the terminology of the paper and therefore been lost in the terminology of the indexing. So the traditional Chinese medicine aspect has been stripped away, and in most cases you'll have acupuncture just paired with osteoarthritis, not acknowledging the causal factors according to traditional Chinese medicine, such as the yin deficiency. So this example here is actually an outlier, and what you'd find in most cases is you have the Eastern intervention but the Western pathology. And that's a difficult line to walk if you're trying to really get a handle on the research and how well it was conducted, and whether it was conducted from an acupuncture expert TCM perspective, or whether it was conducted from potentially an MD who does some very limited acupuncture practice on the side. So if I could get the next slide. So what's the answer? So far, I've problematized PubMed's mesh. I've told you that their terminology isn't specific, that the hierarchies artificially divorce the practice from the medicine, and that the Western practice of Eastern approaches is suddenly being rebranded. Well, the answer, unfortunately, is the question. There is no simple way to get around this. The only way that we can address these challenges is knowing to ask these questions. So with all the potential pitfalls and searching for acupuncture research, all I can do as a librarian, and what I teach my students to do as researchers, is to be hyper aware of the biases and the structure of the publication process, of the indexing language, and knowing how that we can address and tweak our search behaviors to alert ourselves to and compensate for the potential shortcomings of the database. And unfortunately, what this often means is, in reality, you end up doing a very broad search and having to use what I call the human filter instead of the database filter, where no indexer and no database is going to be fully nuanced in the understanding of traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture, or not as fully educated as an acupuncture researcher would be. So you really have to rely on your own critical thinking to filter through. And that's honestly, at this point, that's where we're at. You can work with what's there, and some of the acupuncture mesh headings will pull in a lot of the relevant information, but if you try and drill down beyond that, the yin deficiency mesh heading isn't applied consistently, the qi mesh heading isn't applied consistently. So it's up to the researchers to ask themselves those questions, make sure they have the broadest possible pool of research available, and then use critical thinking to narrow down beyond that. So that's what I do with the DAOM students. And if I could get the next slide, I'm now going to be Angie, or a stand-in for Angie as well as I can be. A little bit of background about Angie is she works more with students who come to her and professors who come to her with a specific research project already in mind. So it's not like me teaching systematically how to go through a research database, showing all the problems and showing how to get around them and the kind of questions to ask. She deals with a specific topic as it comes up. So the information she's provided to share with us today is about her experience in working on these topics and some of the issues that come up. So the first thing that she's found is the scope of the topic or the question is often a challenge. And she says that sometimes holding a research interview can feel like you're watching Bambi skidding on ice. I think we can all relate to that when you're starting out with a new question. Often patrons come in not fully understanding the depth of the search they need to undertake, and sometimes the question isn't actually that thought out. That I'm sure we can all relate to that if you've ever worked at a reference desk. So for example, something that she has often is students coming in wanting to do a systematic review. And they soon find out that this is going to take much more time and effort than they can spare in a quarter while taking over classes. They also come in a question that's not narrowly defined enough for something like a systematic review. And one thing we've been working towards as a library actually is including definitions of reviews beyond the systematic review and the literature review. There's a link within our live guides that talks about this, and one of the examples that we like and seems to fit our purpose better is a systematized review. And the terminology a systematized review is that it's almost a systematic review, but not quite. So you're following a lot of the steps, but it's not expecting quite the same level of exhaustivity that you would expect for a systematic review that was going to be published in Cochrane, for example. So Angie notes that even with faculty, sometimes this can come up. In the sim fields, faculty are often predominantly practitioners or subject experts. They don't come from a strong research background. So when they're stepping from their practice into the research, they need to work with librarians to review and refresh the research process in order to really be able to effectively engage and scope out their topic. Angie also notes that faculty in sim, like most faculty, are under pressure to publish or perish. So there's a push to write papers, which really would be great for the field. As we've already noted, there is not a huge pool of research to work with. But there is a learning curve to doing good research and writing, of course. And in conventional wisdom in most universities would say systematic reviews are a good way to start publishing. One problem with this is the mainstream conventional wisdom doesn't always map well to sim research. The reason for that is it's a lot of time, effort, and expertise and experience go into systematic reviews, but the big problem for sim is the research has to be there in the first place. It's very difficult to do a systematic review if you only have a handful of research articles to work with in order to start being systematic. It's very difficult to draw conclusions from a handful of potentially problematic or dissimilar methodologies. If I could get the next slide, please. Angie also notes that the types of output are a challenge that she has to work with and educate people about. So she's had an example would be a student comes in wanting to do a systematic review, but really once you start to discuss what that might be, you need quality randomized control trials, and they're very data driven. If a student doesn't have a strong background in data, it's time to start talking them down. Well, maybe a scoping review is really where they're at, ready to plan for a systematic review on a broader topic, which reflects the fact that the research isn't there yet, or potentially the data isn't strong enough to even require a meta-analysis at this point. What often happens is, as you're talking to the researchers, you get talked down from the systematic review, which is what people seem to come in with as the idea of the gold standard, to look at what's actually potentially a more useful contribution to the body of literature from a SIM perspective. And that might be something actually like a case study, the background information that sets up and supports the diagnosis. By adding case studies to the body of research, that's still a very valuable thing to be doing for a SIM practitioner, because unlike allopathic or more mainstream practitioners or researchers, we're not at a point where we have so much research that we need to start summarizing before where we need to go next. We're at the point where there's not enough research out there. Any contribution is helping broaden that research base for future researchers. Again, next slide, please. Angie also wants to draw on a specific example for understanding the goal and output. So she's had research interviews that start out like this. I want to research treatment of fibromyalgia. I read about SIBO treatment of fibromyalgia, and I want to know what other diet affects it. So first you need a place to start. Determine the amount and quality of research before you can jump into publication, let alone a systematic review. So one of the challenges that Angie works with particularly is resetting people's expectations. Are you looking for a connection? Is there a recent paper? Where can you start? What's the clinical question? What is the PICO that you can work with? And can you connect IBS and fibromyalgia? And once you start doing the scoping searching, what she's often found the challenge is there's not enough research for a systematic review at this point. If I could have the next slide, please. Her next example is something that she wanted to talk about as an example of clearly defining the question. So another research project she worked with are skin diseases and intestinal dysbiosis related. Sorry, some of the medical terminology trips me up. Even with my long name, I'm not great at pronouncing things. So while this might sound like a good question, it's very broad and very open for multiple interpretations. And there are many ways to define related. Is it causal? Is it comorbid? Is it drug-induced? Skin diseases, also very broad. There are over 40 mesh terms included, which include things like hair diseases, nail diseases, sweat, subcategories of skin. And each one of those has their own mesh tree. If we think back to acupuncture, which only has 5 for the entire topic, that's a very broad jump to go from 5 to 40. The other challenge that comes up with SIM research when you're clearly defining the question is SIM practitioners tend to think holistically. They think in whole body systems. They want to address the whole patient. They ask very broad questions and narrow down and take multiple data points when they're treating someone. This does not map well to the scientific technique that is preferred by researchers when they're doing systematic reviews. You want a very specific question that lends itself to academic research. So it's bridging that gap between the SIM practitioner's natural tendency to want to do big picture, broad questions and pulling it down to something that's going to be acceptably specific for an academic question. And this is often the work of a librarian who helps them sit down, look at what's available, and do lots of exploratory searching in order to define and refine that question. If I can have Angie's final example, please. Angie's final example is the issue of understanding the terms. And this goes along with some of the challenges I was describing with acupuncture terminology. Even when there is a very precise mesh term, such as hydrotherapy, it may not be adequate to cover the concepts required. And it may also be capturing topics that the researcher isn't really looking for. So something that comes up with hydrotherapy that's often a red herring would be irrigation. So it's still good to go through an abstract and look for the terms that the author uses and then OR them into the search. So this is the example that I was talking about with acupuncture as well. You can use mesh terms to get you so far, but you then either need to use the human filter, as I call it, to read through the abstracts and make sure it really is saying what you thought it was, and then also using some advanced search techniques to add in OR terms into your search. You also have to have them brainstorm all the possible synonyms. Many get stuck on 1 or 2 terms, and due to the limitations on indexing for SIM techniques and terminology, we really don't want to leave any room for error. That's where you get these very long search strings where you're adding in all the synonyms manually to make sure you're catching things that weren't caught by the indexers. Some of the techniques from a good systematic search technique are actually helpful to open their eyes to some of the difficulty that Jane has already mentioned, such as the differences in terminology, the lack of mesh terms, or the inconsistencies in the definition or use of mesh terms. One of the big challenges we have as librarians is giving someone all this information really can be drinking from the fire hose. When you consider that I have 3 courses to teach this to DAOM students, when Angie's working with students on reference interviews for systematic reviews or reviews, she has to do this in one-on-one sessions as it comes up. So the summary of the challenges that Angie faces is before she can even start searching, she has to help the patron understand their goal. What will they eventually do with the research? What can they expect to do with the research? Having them clearly define the clinical question is so important, and it's something that we work on with students, but faculty can also use guidance. We really work very hard to make sure that people are thinking about PICO, the intervention, the comparison, the outcome, the patient population. How specific are you being with each one of these sections? And then are they realistically going to map to a valid question that's going to garner useful results? The next challenge she has is once you get into the research, digging in and uncovering the extent of the research. Sometimes a really good question isn't answerable yet. We can't reasonably draw any conclusions due to the body of research just not being there. Not all topics are created equal, and not all areas have the same depth of research yet. So of course, as I also pointed out, and Angie has found, again, understanding the mesh, the medical subject headings, the definitions, and how the terms are used, asking these questions. What is it supposed to mean? Is it finding everything? Am I missing something? Do I need to use other terms or resources? All of these are challenges that come up to the nth degree when you're doing SIM research, although they are familiar to people outside SIM as well. And I'm sorry I've gone over. Angie gave me a lot of details to cover there. We should open it up for questions now.
All right, so we have, that was amazing, by the way, both of you. Thank you so much for that great presentation. I think you had a couple of examples there. Renee, if you want to forward a couple of slides, some of your EIP resources.
Yes,
sorry, thank you.
Yeah, just go to the next one, Ekaterini.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, we have the tutorials that we have for the ND students. That's ICS 1 through 3 and 4 through 6. That shows you the online portion, at least what we talk about and walk students through in the ND program. And then we also have a webinar that we did a couple of years ago about the EIP program.
And I noticed in the email that went out, there are links to different resources. So that pertain to CAM research. So in the email you received, there are other links.
Great, and we will go ahead and we're recording this whole session as well, and we'll go ahead and put the slide deck out with that. I'll follow up with everybody who's on the call today. So if anybody wanted to ask a question, because you are on mute, on the top left on your control panel, there's a little hand. And if you push that, I can unmute you if you wanted to ask a question, open this up for discussion. So I'm looking for some hands, if that works for anybody. Or you can type a question into the question box as well. Or I can unmute everybody, which could be a little bit loud. Why don't I try that? I'm going to unmute everyone. So we'll go with that. And if we have any questions, you can just jump in. Let me try to do that. Oh, some people say no questions at this time. So I'll go ahead and unmute folks.
I have a question. Oh. Can I go ahead?
Yes.
So my name's Ann Glusker. I work for the Pacific Northwest Region's National Network of Libraries of Medicine. Hi, Jane. I'm just wondering, do you have any strategies that you use when people are resistant to changing their research question, when they are faced with the fact that there's not really going to be a lot to work with?
From my experience working with faculty and students with systematic reviews, I haven't encountered resistance, Anne.
Good.
I think diplomacy and just, reading, just being forthright and letting them know the details, which they're not aware of, that often that resolves the problem. Going from a systematic review to a case study, that would be quite a few steps down. But a lot of the topics that our students and faculty want to research don't have a lot of research, and you certainly can't do a systematic review if you don't have a good solid base of randomized control trials to assess.
Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question. My name is Deb Kogan. I'm just starting as a librarian at the East West College of Natural Medicine in Sarasota, Florida.
Welcome.
And my question is, has anyone created, or is there sort of some kind of list maybe that's been created of search terms? I know you're saying that you just sort of need to go into the mesh terms and poke around, but I'm just saying, has there been any efforts to create some kind of a more friendly list of terms that librarians can use, or any kind of guides to help with searching?
One of our lab guides, let's see, New Directions in CAM Research, I can't remember the exact title, that was linked from the email, that has a sub-tab for mesh terms, and we haven't put in keywords, but it has all of the TCM terms and all of the Chinese herbal medicine terms that PubMed has, and they're linked to their hierarchy in the mesh database.
Oh, okay.
And if you have trouble finding that, please feel free to email Jane at library@bastyr.edu. I'd be very happy to send that link. It didn't make it into our
But you're saying that should be on the first email we received about this webinar?
Yeah, it's one of those. It's one of those links.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Is that it? Any more questions?
I was also going to ask, are there any attempts to put together, like, I don't know, lists of reference books, and things that should be in, an acupuncture school library, recommended lists of titles and things like that?
You're very welcome to email us. I know that all of the acupuncture schools would have, well, there definitely would be a core list that we would all agree on, and then there would be others. So depending on your budget, we could make some recommendations.
Okay.
Do you have a library?
Yeah, I'm going to be starting at a library. They have about 2,500 things. I haven't even really, dug into the collection yet, so I don't even know what's there.
Okay. Well, feel free. Librarians are very collaborative, so if you need help with anything, just let us know.
Thank you.
Jane, this is Deb. I was on mute earlier, but there is one question in the box from Stephanie.
Yes.
She asked, you only have one quarter with students to cover an introduction to EIP research and the challenges to STEM research. What would you prioritize?
I would prioritize and Akatarini may have a comment about this too. I would prioritize the approach itself and forming the questions, because if you can't develop a good clinical question, then you won't be able to answer it efficiently. It's also a matter of understanding the resources so that you are somewhat aware of how the databases are thinking about your question. But Ekaterini, do you have comments about that? Oh, she's on mute, but she's the one who's heading up. Yeah, let's unmute Ekaterini, could we?
You should be unmuted. My apologies.
Here, come and talk here.
Oh, I think I unmuted myself. Does that work?
Ah, yeah.
There you go. Hooray. Okay, yeah, definitely agree with Jane in forming a good clinically answerable question. Something I've noticed with students is when they're looking for evidence that's specific to a patient question, if they don't have the PICO in their head to go, okay, what's my patient, what's my intervention, what's the research out there? What tends to happen is they hypothesize on what the outcome might be or what the research might be, and they add those hypothetical terminologies into their question, and that can really muddy the waters. So really getting a strong PICO question, particularly the P and I, and getting familiar with something like PubMed, because it's one of the few things that's available for free. So if you can use that, you've got a good grounding. Sorry, there's a lot of noise on the line. Was that audible?
I can hear it. This is
okay, good.
Yeah. My comment about PubMed is PubMed's indexing about 1/3 of the world's medical literature. There just isn't one source that's indexing all of the credible, high-quality medical journals in the world. So it's exploring multiple sources. But PubMed's great because it is free.
This is Deb. Does anybody else have any other questions before we sign off? I know that we're a little bit over the hour here, but we can take a couple more if we can add any or any. Oops.
It's okay.
All right.
I just had a quick question. Is there a way to get like a certificate or something for watching this, or I didn't know if you guys were doing that at all.
You know, we haven't. We are basically providing this as part of our library group that we have.
Okay.
In terms of you know, helping to share information and communicate and collaborate. So hopefully there's been a lot of great information that's been helpful today. And I think that's where we're going to leave it for now, at least. But maybe we'll look into something like that.
Okay, great.
Thank you. Well, thanks to everyone who has attended, and thank you to Jane and Ekaterini for all of your work in this. We really appreciate it, and I hope that everybody has a great rest of the day. I'll go ahead and follow up with some emails and make sure that all this information comes your way after the presentation today. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you so much. just have one client and one for just my little Andreas couple, that's all. And you can be there.